He had everything: power, wealth, and a kingdom that worshipped him. But in a single moment, everything was taken away, betrayed, abandoned, and left with nothing. This king was about to face the most painful truth of his life. He was the mightiest ruler of his time, a man whose name alone struck fear into the hearts of his enemies and commanded unwavering loyalty from his people. His kingdom flourished like no other, its streets lined with gold, its people well-fed and prosperous. Merchants traveled from distant lands just to trade under his rule, and poets sang songs of his greatness. He was not just a king, he was a legend. Born into royalty, he had been groomed to lead from the moment he could walk. His father, a ruler of great wisdom, had instilled in him the virtues of justice, discipline, and honor. But as the years passed and power became his, something within him began to change. With every victory and battle, his confidence grew stronger. With every conquest, his belief in his own infallibility solidified. The people adored him, his army feared him, and his wealth knew no bounds. Yet, with power came arrogance, and with arrogance came mistakes. He no longer listened to the wise counsel of his advisors. Once a leader who sought the wisdom of elders before making decisions, he now dismissed them with a wave of his hand. "What could they possibly know that I do not?" he often thought. His word was final, his commands unquestionable. Those who dared to challenge his decisions were quickly silenced or cast aside. The people still loved him, but murmurs of his growing pride began to spread. The king was changing, they whispered. He had once been a ruler of the people, but now he was becoming something else. Something distant, something untouchable. Even his most trusted general, a man who had fought beside him in countless wars, began to notice the shift. "My king," he once said, kneeling before him, "a great ruler is one who leads with wisdom, not just power. Do not let the weight of your crown blind you to the truth." But the king only laughed. "I am the truth," he declared. "I have built this empire with my own hands. No man will tell me how to rule." And so the warnings continued to go unheard. As his power grew, so did his thirst for more. He raised taxes to fund grander palaces, luxurious feasts, and extravagant monuments in his honor. His advisors cautioned him, reminding him that a kingdom is only as strong as the people who serve it, but he saw no threats, no reason to slow down. He had never known defeat, and in his mind, he never would. The kingdom was still thriving, but beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. The once joyful laughter in the streets was fading, replaced by silent unease. Loyal allies who had once sworn to serve him for life began to question his rule. And the greatest danger of all, the one he refused to see, his enemies were no longer outside his gates. They were within his own walls. The king's power had once been built on wisdom and fairness, but now it rested solely on fear. He had grown blind to the concerns of his people, deaf to the warnings of his most loyal advisors. Where once he had ruled with a sense of duty, he now ruled with arrogance, convinced that his greatness was untouchable. As time passed, the signs of trouble became impossible to ignore. His advisors, the very men who had helped him build his empire, hesitated before speaking in his presence. They had seen what happened to those who disagreed with him. He had exiled some, imprisoned others, and those who remained had learned to nod in silent agreement. The kingdom's prosperity had once been a result of wise counsel, but now it was dictated by one man's unchecked will. His thirst for power extended beyond his own borders. He waged unnecessary wars, believing that his empire could never be too vast, his influence never too great. The kingdom's wealth, once carefully preserved, was now poured into endless battles and monuments that bore his name. His people grew restless, burdened by heavy taxes that funded a ruler who seemed to care little for them. But the most dangerous threat was not the growing discontent among his people. It was the betrayal forming in the shadows of his own palace. Among his trusted circle was a man who had once been his most devoted ally, a commander who had fought alongside him in countless battles. For years he had been loyal, but loyalty had turned to resentment. He had warned the king many times, pleaded with him to listen, but his words had been ignored. The more the king tightened his grip, the more enemies he unknowingly created. The commander was not the only one who had lost faith. The ministers, the generals, and even the nobles who had once praised him in public now whispered behind closed doors. They saw what the king refused to see. The kingdom was crumbling, and soon it would collapse entirely. One evening, as the king sat upon his throne, surrounded by those who still pretended to be loyal, he failed to notice the silence in the room. He failed to see the cautious glances exchanged between his advisors, the tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. He believed he was still in control, but what he did not know was that the walls around him had already begun to close in. The betrayal had already been planned, the pieces carefully placed. His greatest mistake was not waging wars, not raising taxes, not even exiling his most trusted advisors. His greatest mistake was believing that he was untouchable, because in that very moment, the ones he trusted most were plotting his downfall. The betrayal did not come with the clash of swords or the cries of war. It came in silence, in whispers exchanged in darkened halls, in the careful plotting of those he had once called his most trusted allies. For years they had stood by his side, sworn their loyalty, and pledged to protect his throne. But loyalty built on fear is fragile, and power that is abused will always invite rebellion. The king remained blind to the growing storm around him. He still believed that his rule was absolute, that his name alone was enough to command obedience. He saw the nervous glances of his advisors, the hesitant voices of his generals, but he dismissed them as weakness. What he failed to realize was that fear had turned into resentment, and resentment had turned into action. One fateful night, the betrayal unfolded. His most trusted general, the man who had once fought beside him in countless battles, led the charge. The castle gates were opened from within, and the enemy did not need to break down walls. They were invited inside. The king's guards, once loyal to the crown, had been bribed or threatened into submission. He had ruled with an iron fist for too long, and now that very fist had begun to crumble. As the sounds of battle filled the air, the king finally understood the depth of his mistake. The palace, once a symbol of his power, was now a battlefield. Flames consumed the banners that bore his crest, and the very throne he had believed to be untouchable was abandoned as chaos spread. Those who had once sworn to serve him now stood against him, not out of greed, but out of a desperate need for change. He fought to defend himself, but it was a battle already lost. His closest advisors had vanished, his army had turned against him, and the people, the very ones he had once ruled over, stood outside the burning palace, watching in silence. There were no tears, no cries for mercy, only quiet acceptance that this was the fate he had brought upon himself. When the gates finally fell and the throne room was stormed, the king did not beg. He did not plead for his life. He stood, stripped of his crown, his royal robes tattered, and for the first time he saw his kingdom not through the eyes of a ruler, but through the eyes of a man who had lost everything. He was not executed, nor was he locked away in a dungeon. His punishment was far worse, exile. Stripped of his title, his wealth, and the very identity he had built his life around, he was cast out into the world with nothing but the weight of his own mistakes. The mighty king had fallen, and now, for the first time in his life, he would have to learn what it truly meant to be powerless. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The once mighty king, who had once commanded an empire, now wandered alone, stripped of his power, his wealth, and his identity. The weight of his past clung to him like a shadow, haunting his every step. He had spent his entire life believing that strength came from dominance, that leadership was about control. But now he had nothing left to control. For the first time, he had no army to command, no court to praise him, no riches to blind him from the truth. He had only himself, his thoughts, his regrets, and the cold realization that everything he had built had crumbled because of his own arrogance. The betrayal that had shattered his kingdom had not come from his enemies. It had been born from within, nurtured by his own blindness. His greatest battle had never been against foreign invaders or political rivals. It had always been against himself. The truth came to him slowly, painfully, like a wound that refused to heal. He had ruled with fear instead of wisdom, demanded loyalty instead of earning it. He had believed himself invincible, beyond the reach of consequence. But power is not eternal. Respect is not commanded. It is given. And the moment he had stopped serving his people, they had stopped seeing him as their king. Memories of his past decisions replayed in his mind like an unrelenting storm. The dismissed warnings of his advisers, the silent suffering of his people, the greed that had consumed him, all of it led to his downfall. He had mistaken obedience for devotion, fear for loyalty. And now, standing with nothing, he understood the truth that had evaded him for so long. A ruler is not defined by the wealth he possesses, nor by the strength of his army. True power does not come from a throne or a crown. True power comes from the ability to uplift others, to rule with humility, to serve rather than demand. A king is not measured by how much he can take from his people, but by how much he is willing to give. For the first time in his life, he understood, and for the first time in his life, he was ready to change. Years passed, but the weight of his past never left him. He had lost everything, yet in losing, he had gained something far more valuable, understanding. He had once believed power was his birthright, that leadership meant control. But now he saw the truth. A ruler's strength does not come from fear, but from the trust of his people. With nothing left to prove, he returned, not as a king, but as a man who had learned his greatest lesson. He walked through the streets where his name had once been spoken with both reverence and fear. The people who once bowed to him now watched with quiet curiosity. He did not demand their loyalty, nor did he seek to reclaim his throne. Instead, he listened, he learned, he served. Brick by brick, he helped rebuild the city he had once neglected. He worked beside the very people he had once ruled over, not as their master, but as one of them. He gave not out of duty, but out of a genuine desire to mend what he had broken. Slowly, the walls of distrust began to fall. Those who had once feared him now saw him in a different light. He no longer needed a throne to lead. His wisdom became his crown, his honesty, his armor. And in the hearts of the people, he became something greater than a king. He became a symbol of redemption. He had lost everything only to find what truly mattered. And as he stood atop a hill, looking over the kingdom he had nearly destroyed, he smiled, not with pride, but with peace. His greatest legacy was not the empire he built, but the lessons he left behind. What is the true measure of a great leader? Power or wisdom? Share your thoughts in the comments below.